In the underworld, silence is survival, but a single misunderstood word can start a war. When Alessandro Valerius, the most dangerous capo in New York, walked into a negotiation that turned into a death trap, he was missing the one thing money can't buy: a voice. His translator was dead on the floor. The guns were drawn. Hope was gone. Until a trembling waitress, invisible to everyone, stepped out of the shadows and spoke a sentence that froze the room. This isn't just a love story. It's a survival guide. Watch how a spilled tray of champagne changed the fate of the American Mafia forever. The rain over Manhattan wasn't cleaning the streets. It was just making the grime slicker. Inside the Obsidian Lounge, arguably the most exclusive and fortified restaurant in the Tribeca district, the air was dry, conditioned, and smelled faintly of expensive leather and impending violence. Alessandro Valerius did not like waiting. At 32, he was the youngest Don to ever lead the Valerius crime family, a sprawling empire that controlled the ports from Jersey to the Bronx. He sat at the head of a long mahogany table, his posture relaxed, but his eyes, icy, predatory blue, scanning the room. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit, the kind cut by a tailor in Naples, who only took 3 clients a year. To his right stood Marco, his head of security, a man built like a refrigerator and just as cold. To his left sat Julian Thorne, the family's consigliere, checking his watch for the 3rd time. "They are late," Julian muttered, adjusting his glasses. The Sato clan considers lateness a power move. It's an insult, Alessandro. "Let them play their games," Alessandro said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that vibrated through the table. "As long as they sign the territory agreement for the Lower East Side, I don't care if they dance into the room backwards. Where is the translator?" "Here, Don Valerius." A nervous, sweating man in a cheap suit hurried forward. This was Arthur Penhaligon, a linguistic expert hired specifically for this meeting. The Sato clan spoke a very specific archaic dialect of Japanese, used only by the older Yakuza generations, a code language meant to confuse outsiders. Arthur was one of the few verified translators in the city who knew it. "You look ill, Arthur," Alessandro noted, narrowing his eyes. "Just nerves, sir." "Big night," Arthur stammered, wiping his forehead with a handkerchief. At that moment, the double doors swung open. 6 men entered. They moved with the synchronized grace of a hunting pack. In the center walked Kenji Sato, the heir to the Sato Empire. He was young, arrogant, and wore a white suit that stood out starkly in the dim lounge. He didn't smile. The tension in the room spiked. 20 men, 10 on each side, hands hovering near concealed holsters. Alessandro stood up, buttoning his jacket. He nodded to Arthur. "Translate. Tell him welcome to New York, and that I hope his flight was comfortable." Arthur opened his mouth, but instead of Japanese, a wet, choking sound came out. The room froze. Arthur clutched his throat. His eyes bulged, capillaries bursting instantly, turning the whites of his eyes red. He fell to his knees, clawing at his neck, foam bubbling at his lips. "Poison!" Marco shouted, tackling Alessandro to the ground as guns were drawn instantly on both sides. Click-clack. The sound of 20 safety catches disengaging echoed like thunder. "Hold fire!" Alessandro roared from the floor, shoving Marco off him. He stood up, hands raised, palms open. "Nobody shoots unless I say so!" Arthur Penhaligon convulsed once on the expensive Persian rug and went still, dead. The room was locked in a Mexican standoff. The Sato clan was shouting in Japanese, their fingers on the triggers of their submachine guns. Alessandro's men had their Glocks aimed at Sato's head. "Marco, get me a translation," Alessandro hissed, not breaking eye contact with Kenji Sato. "What are they saying?" "I don't know, boss. Arthur was the only one who knew the dialect." Kenji Sato stepped forward, his face twisted in rage. He pointed at the dead translator, then at Alessandro, and screamed a sentence that sounded like harsh, biting poetry. Alessandro stood there, the most powerful man in the city, rendered completely impotent. He didn't understand. If he nodded, he might be agreeing to his own execution. If he shook his head, he might be insulting Sato's honor. One wrong move meant a massacre. In the far corner of the room, near the service station, Audrey Vance pressed her back against the cold marble wall. She was holding a silver tray loaded with crystal flutes of vintage Dom Perignon. Her hands were trembling so hard, the glasses chimed softly against each other. She was nobody. A 23-year-old waitress picking up extra shifts to pay for her mother's medical bills. She had been told to stay invisible. Don't look them in the eye, don't speak. Just pour. But she heard what Kenji Sato screamed, and she knew what it meant. Sato shouted again, stepping closer to Alessandro, raising a gold-plated pistol. He shouted the phrase again, louder, his finger tightening on the trigger. Alessandro's men tensed. They were going to shoot. It was going to be a bloodbath. Audrey's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Stay quiet, her instinct screamed. You are a ghost. You don't exist. But she saw Alessandro's eyes. For a split second, beneath the bravado of the Mafia Don, she saw panic. Pure, human panic. Kenji Sato pulled the hammer of his gun back. Audrey dropped the tray. Crash! The sound of shattering crystal was deafening in the silence. Every head in the room snapped toward the shadows. Audrey stepped forward, her waitress uniform stained with champagne, her hands raised. She looked small, fragile, and utterly out of place among the wolves. He isn't threatening you, Audrey said, her voice shaking but clear. She looked directly at Alessandro. He's asking why you killed the messenger. He thinks you poisoned your own translator to show that you don't need words to kill him. Alessandro stared at her. Who the hell are you? It doesn't matter, Audrey said quickly. She turned to Kenji Sato. She took a deep breath, switching languages. Her posture changed. The tremble in her hands stopped. She spoke, the dialect. The harsh, archaic Japanese flowed from her lips effortlessly, with the perfect cadence of a native born in the Kyoto underworld. The wolf of New York does not kill with poison, Lord Sato. Poison is the weapon of a coward, and this man is many things, but he is not a coward. The translator was silenced by a third party who wishes to see our families destroy each other tonight. Kenji Sato lowered his gun an inch. He looked at the waitress, stunned. He fired back a rapid, complex question about honor and lineage. Audrey didn't hesitate. She fired back, her tone respectful but firm, using honorifics that hadn't been common since the 19th century. Alessandro watched, mesmerized. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the power shift. The tiny waitress was commanding the room. She was standing between two armies, unarmed, fighting a war with nothing but her tongue. Sato slowly lowered his gun completely. He holstered it. He looked at Alessandro, then nodded once, sharply. He says... Audrey turned back to Alessandro, her face pale, the adrenaline starting to fade. He says he will give you 10 minutes to explain who killed the man on the floor. If you lie, he will burn this building down with all of us inside. Alessandro exhaled, a sound like a tire losing air. He looked at Marco. Secure the exits. Nobody leaves. Find out who poisoned Arthur. Then, he walked over to Audrey. He towered over her, smelling of gunpowder and expensive cologne. He reached out and touched her chin, tilting her face up. You speak the old dialect, he said, his voice low. Waitresses at the Obsidian don't speak the old dialect. Who are you? Audrey pulled away, clutching her tray. Just a waitress, sir. Please. I just want to go home. Alessandro stared at her for a long moment. The danger hadn't passed. It had just shifted. Nobody goes home, Alessandro said softly. Not until I know why a girl serving drinks knows the language of assassins. The body of Arthur Penhaligon was dragged out the back exit by 2 of Marco's men. The stain on the rug remained, a dark reminder of how close they were to annihilation. The negotiation resumed, but the dynamic had shifted entirely. Alessandro sat at the head of the table, but he was no longer the sole focus. Beside him, in a chair that had been hastily pulled up, sat Audrey Vance. She looked ridiculous, A petite woman in a stained black and white waitress uniform sitting between two of the most dangerous crime lords in the world. But every time she opened her mouth, the men leaned in. She was the bridge. "Tell him," Alessandro said, his eyes fixed on Kenji, "that the territory in the Lower East Side is his to operate, provided he pays the 20% tariff on all imports." Audrey translated. She didn't just repeat the words, she softened Alessandro's aggression. She used words that implied partnership rather than subjugation. Kenji listened, stroked his chin, and replied. "Mr. Sato asks about the assurances of police protection." Audrey translated back. "He is worried about the federal raids near the docks. Tell him I own the police captain of the 5th Precinct. The docks are safer than a church." For 2 hours they went back and forth. Audrey's throat was dry, her head pounding. She was navigating a minefield. She knew that one mistranslation, one wrong inflection, could restart the standoff. She saw the way Marco, the bodyguard, watched her, with suspicion, his hand never leaving his holster. Finally, Kenji Sato stood up. He bowed deeply to Alessandro, a sign of immense respect. Then, surprisingly, he turned and bowed to Audrey. "You have the tongue of a diplomat and the heart of a warrior," Kenji said in Japanese. "If you ever tire of serving this barbarian, the Sato clan has a place for you." Audrey lowered her eyes. "You honor me, Lord Sato, but I seek only a quiet life." Kenji laughed, a harsh barking sound. "There is no quiet life for people like us." With that, the Sato clan swept out of the room, leaving a heavy silence in their wake. Alessandro let out a long breath and poured himself a glass of whiskey. He downed it in one swallow. The tension in his shoulders dropped, but the intensity in his eyes sharpened as he turned to Audrey. "You saved us," Julian, the consigliere, said, looking at her with new interest. "Where did you learn that? That dialect it's virtually extinct." "My father," Audrey said quietly, standing up, "he was a professor. Linguistics. He taught me." "A professor?" Alessandro repeated, standing up and walking around the table. He moved like a panther, silent and heavy. "What was his name?" John Vance." Alessandro looked at Julian. Julian pulled out a tablet and tapped rapidly. After a few seconds, he shook his head. "No record of a Professor John Vance in any major university in the last 30 years. Alessandro smirked. "Lying to me already, Tesoro, treasure?" "I'm not lying," Audrey said, her voice rising. "Look, I did my job. You're alive. Can I please get my pay and leave?" "My shift ended an hour ago." Alessandro ignored her request. He walked to the window, looking out at the rain-soaked streets of New York. Arthur was poisoned. That means someone on the inside got to him. Someone knew the meeting was happening tonight. Someone wanted a war with the Yakuza. He turned back to her. "You are the only variable they didn't account for. You ruined their plan." "I'm sorry?" Audrey asked, confused. "Don't be," Alessandro said. "But do you understand what that means? The person who killed Arthur, they are watching. They know you stepped in. They know you fixed it. By morning, your face will be on a hit list." Audrey's blood ran cold. "What? No, I'm just a waitress." "Not anymore," Alessandro said. He snapped his fingers. Marco stepped forward, blocking Audrey's path to the door. "What are you doing?" Audrey backed away, bumping into the table. "I can't let you leave," Alessandro said, his voice void of emotion. "If you walk out that door, you'll be dead in an hour. And frankly, I need you. Arthur is dead, and I have meetings with the Russians and the Albanians next week. Good translators are clearly hard to find." "You can't kidnap me," Audrey shouted. "It's not a kidnapping," Alessandro said, buttoning his jacket. "It's a job offer. Exclusive contract. You live in my penthouse. You eat my food. You go where I go. And you translate everything. And if I refuse?" Alessandro walked up to her, invading her personal space until she could feel the heat radiating off him. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a stack of cash, more money than she made in a year. He tucked it into the apron of her uniform. "Refusal is death, Audrey. Someone tried to frame me tonight. Until I find out who, you are the most valuable asset I have, and I protect my assets." He turned to Marco. "Get her a coat." "She's coming with us to the estate." Audrey looked around the room. The doors were barred. The men were giants. She thought of her mother, sick in the small apartment in Queens, waiting for her to come home with medicine money. "My mother," Audrey whispered. "I can't just leave her." Alessandro paused. He looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time. He saw the desperation in her eyes. It reminded him of something from his own past. "Write down the address," Alessandro commanded Julian. "Send a medical team, private nurses, round-the-clock security. She will be treated like a queen, better than she would be with you there." He extended a hand to Audrey. It wasn't a request, it was a summons. "Welcome to the family, Audrey." She hesitated. She looked at the hand, scarred and dangerous. Then she looked at the door, which might as well have been a tombstone. Audrey Vance took the Mafia boss's hand. The drive from Tribeca to the Valerius estate was a study in suffocating silence. Audrey sat in the back of the armored Maybach, the leather seats soft as butter against her skin, smelling of cedar and cold air conditioning. Outside, the New York skyline blurred into streaks of rain-slicked light, a world she was rapidly being pulled away from. Alessandro sat across from her. He hadn't spoken since they left the restaurant. He had opened a laptop and was reading reports, the blue light of the screen illuminating the sharp angles of his face. He looked like a statue carved from marble, beautiful, hard, and utterly unyielding. Audrey's phone had been taken. Her apron, stained with the cheap wine of the restaurant, felt heavy and ridiculous in this luxury vehicle. "Where are we going?" she asked. Her voice sounded small, swallowed by the hum of the engine. Alessandro didn't look up. "The Palisades. It's a 40-minute drive. Sleep." "I can't sleep," she snapped, the fear giving way to a spark of anger. "You just kidnapped me. You have men surrounding my mother's apartment. You think I can nap?" Alessandro finally looked up. He closed the laptop with a soft click. He studied her, his gaze traveling from her messy bun to her scuffed work shoes. It wasn't a look of desire. It was the look of an appraiser examining a diamond in the rough. "You are not kidnapped, Audrey. You are acquired." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Let's be clear about your situation. The man who poisoned my translator is likely a member of La Cosa Nostra or a rival syndicate. They want me dead. They want a war with the Japanese. You stopped that war. By doing so, you made yourself a target. If I drop you off at your apartment in Queens, you will be dead before you can unlock your front door." "I'll take my chances," she whispered. "No, you won't," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "Because if you die, I lose the only person who can verify what Sato said tonight, and I don't like losing assets." The car turned off the highway, winding up a steep private road lined with towering pines. Iron gates, massive and imposing, swung open automatically as the convoy approached. The Valerius estate was not a house. It was a fortress disguised as a mansion. Built of gray stone and glass, it perched on the edge of a cliff overlooking the Hudson River. Floodlights illuminated the grounds, revealing patrolling guards with German shepherds. As the car stopped, Marco opened the door. "We're here, boss." Alessandro stepped out, buttoning his suit jacket. He didn't wait for Audrey. He walked toward the massive oak front doors, expecting her to follow. Audrey stepped onto the gravel. The air here was cleaner, colder. She looked at the house. It was beautiful, undeniably. But as she looked up at the high windows, she didn't see a home. She saw the bars of a very expensive cage. Inside, the foyer was a cavern of black marble and crystal chandeliers. A woman in a severe black dress was waiting. She was older, with silver hair pulled back into a tight bun. "This is Mrs. Gable," Alessandro said, tossing his keys onto a side table. "She runs the household. Mrs. Gable, this is Miss Vance. She will be staying in the East Wing, the Blue Room." Mrs. Gable's eyebrows shot up. "The Blue Room, sir. That suite is next to yours." "I need her close," Alessandro said simply, "for security." He turned to Audrey. Burn those clothes. You smell like stale champagne and fear. Mrs. Gable will provide you with something appropriate. Dinner is at 9. Do not be late." He turned and walked up the grand staircase, leaving Audrey standing in the foyer, shivering. "Come with me, child," Mrs. Gable said, her voice surprisingly gentle but firm. Audrey was led through hallways lined with oil paintings that probably cost more than her entire life's earnings. They arrived at the Blue Room. It was massive, larger than her entire apartment. A 4-poster bed dominated the space, draped in silk. Floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over the dark river. "The bathroom is there," Mrs. Gable said, pointing to a door. "I have drawn a bath. Leave your uniform on the floor. I will have the staff dispose of it." "Dispose of it?" Audrey asked. It's my uniform. I need it for work." Mrs. Gable looked at her with pity. "You won't be needing it anymore, dear?" When the door clicked shut, Audrey was finally alone. She walked to the bathroom. The tub was a deep porcelain basin filled with steaming water that smelled of lavender and bergamot. She stripped off the uniform. She looked at herself in the massive mirror. She looked pale, her eyes wide and dark. There were bruises on her arm where Marco had grabbed her earlier. She sank into the water, letting the heat seep into her bones. She closed her eyes and tried to cry, but the tears wouldn't come. Instead, a cold resolve was settling in her stomach. She thought of the dialect she had spoken, the old tongue. Alessandro thought her father was a professor. If only he knew, she thought, sinking lower until the water covered her ears, muffling the silence of the house. If he knew who really taught me that language, he wouldn't just keep me prisoner. He would put a bullet in my head himself. The dress Mrs. Gable had left on the bed was not something a waitress wore. It was a slip of midnight blue silk that clung to every curve, elegant but exposing. It was a statement. It said, "You belong to the house now." Audrey put it on. She felt like an imposter. She brushed her hair until it shone, leaving it down to cover her bare shoulders. She had no makeup, but the flush of anxiety in her cheeks provided enough color. At 9 p.m. precisely, a knock came at the door. It was Marco. "Don expects you," he grunted. He escorted her down to the dining room. It was a long, cavernous hall, lit only by candlelight. A fire roared in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Alessandro sat at the head of the table. He had changed into a black dress shirt, sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle and inked with faint, faded tattoos, scars of a life lived in violence. He didn't stand when she entered. He watched her walk the length of the room. The silk rustled softly. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the chair to his immediate right. The table was set for 12, but only 2 places were laid. Servants materialized from the shadows, placing plates of seared scallops and truffle risotto before them. They poured a deep red wine into crystal goblets. "Eat," Alessandro commanded. "My chef is Michelin-starred. It is better than whatever you are going to have in Queens." Audrey picked up her fork. Her hand was steady now. "My mother," she said, not touching the food. "I need to call her. She will worry." "I told you," Alessandro said, cutting into a scallop with surgical precision. "It is handled." "My men told her you were offered a specialized translation job for a corporate merger. A very lucrative one. They gave her an advance on your salary. She is currently watching TV and eating a meal delivered from a top-tier bistro. She is happy, Audrey. Probably happier than she has been in months." Audrey stared at him. He had thought of everything. He had woven a lie so comforting she couldn't even fight it. "Why me?" she asked. "There are other translators." "Not who speak the Sado dialect, and certainly not ones who can stare down a Yakuza boss while holding a tray of champagne." Alessandro took a sip of wine, his eyes locking onto hers. "Let's talk about that. Your father? The professor?" Audrey felt a spike of adrenaline. "What about him?" "I had Julian run a deeper check while you were bathing," Alessandro said calmly. "There is no record of a John Vance teaching linguistics at Columbia, NYU, or Yale. In fact, The only John Vance I found was a low-level bookie who died in a car accident in 1998. The room went deadly silent. The fire popped, a loud crack in the quiet. He taught privately, Audrey said, her voice tight. He was eccentric. He didn't like institutions. Is that so? Alessandro leaned back, swirling his wine. And did this eccentric private tutor also teach you how to identify the safety catch on a Sig Sauer P226? Because when Marco pulled his gun in the restaurant, your eyes didn't go to his face. They went to his trigger finger. You checked his discipline. Audrey froze. She hadn't realized she'd done it. It was muscle memory, instinct. I watch action movies, she lied. It was a weak lie. Alessandro laughed. It was a dry, humorless sound. You are a terrible liar, Audrey. But it makes you interesting. Everyone in my world is a professional liar. You? You are an amateur trying to hide a professional skill set. He stood up and walked behind her chair. She stiffened, feeling his presence like a physical weight. He leaned down, his mouth close to her ear. She could smell the whiskey and the danger. I will find out the truth, he whispered. I always do. But for now, you are safe here. As long as you are useful. He walked back to his seat. Finish your risotto, it's getting cold. The rest of the dinner passed in silence. Audrey ate mechanically, tasting nothing. She realized she was in a game of chess, and she had already lost her pawns. After dinner, Alessandro dismissed her. Go to your room. Lock the door. Do not open it for anyone but me or Mrs. Gable. The house is secure, but paranoia keeps you alive longer than optimism. Audrey retreated to the blue room. She locked the heavy oak door and threw the deadbolt. She leaned against it, breathing hard. The room was dark, illuminated only by the moonlight streaming through the window. She walked over to the bed to sit down, exhausted. That's when she saw it. On the pristine white pillow of the bed, there was an object. It was a small, folded piece of paper. And resting on top of it was a single, dried, black rose. Audrey's heart stopped. She hadn't left the room for more than an hour. The door had been locked when she left. Mrs. Gable had the only key. She reached out with trembling fingers and picked up the paper. It was heavy, expensive cardstock. She unfolded it. There were no words, just a symbol drawn in black ink. A serpent eating its own tail. The Ouroboros. Audrey dropped the note as if it were burning hot. She backed away, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a scream. She knew that symbol. It wasn't the Sato clan. It wasn't the Italian Mafia. It was the symbol of the Vipera, a mercenary group of assassins that operated out of Eastern Europe. The group her father had spent his life running from. The group that she had spent her entire childhood learning to hide from. They were here, inside Alessandro's fortress. Someone in the house wasn't just a traitor to Alessandro. They were hunting her. She heard a sound. The doorknob to her room rattled. She had locked it. She was sure she had locked it. Slowly, the heavy bronze handle began to turn. Audrey looked around frantically for a weapon. A lamp, a vase, anything. She grabbed a heavy brass candlestick from the mantelpiece. The lock clicked. The door creaked open, just an inch. Audrey? It was Alessandro's voice. She didn't lower the candlestick. Stay back, she hissed. Alessandro pushed the door open fully. He was still in his dress shirt, but he had a gun in his hand, held loosely, pointed at the floor. He saw her standing there, barefoot in the silk dress, wielding a candlestick like a club, her eyes wild with terror. He stepped in and kicked the door shut behind him. Put that down. I heard a noise in the hall. Someone was in here, she gasped, pointing at the bed. Look. Alessandro moved to the bed. He saw the black rose. He saw the note. His face changed. The arrogance vanished, replaced by a cold, lethal intensity. He didn't recognize the symbol, but he recognized the threat. Who put this here? He demanded, turning to her. I don't know, Audrey cried. I came back from dinner, and it was here. Alessandro picked up the note with a handkerchief, careful not to smudge prints. He looked at the Ouroboros symbol. What does this mean? He asked her. You reacted to it. You know what this is. Audrey looked at him. If she told him, she admitted her past. She admitted She was the daughter of a rogue assassin, not a professor. She admitted she was dangerous. But if she didn't tell him, the Viper would kill them both. "It means," Audrey whispered, her voice shaking, "that your fortress has a leak, Alessandro. And they aren't here for your money. They are here to erase a mistake." "What mistake?" "Me." Alessandro stared at her. The air between them crackled with tension. For the first time, he didn't look at her like a possession. He looked at her like an equal in the game of survival. He walked over to the windows and slammed the heavy velvet drapes shut, plunging the room into semi-darkness. He checked the safety on his gun. "Get your shoes," Alessandro said, his voice low and deadly. "Why?" "Because you're not sleeping in this room tonight," he said, moving toward her. "If they can get a rose onto your pillow, they can get a knife into your throat. You're sleeping in my room." I can't," Audrey stammered. "It wasn't a request, Audrey." He reached out and took the candlestick from her hand, setting it down gently. His hand lingered on hers for a second longer than necessary. His skin was warm, rough. "Tonight, you are the bait, and I am the trap. Now move." Alessandro's master suite was a testament to a man who expected to die alone. It was stark, monochromatic, and cold. The walls were lined with dark slate, and the massive bed sat in the center like an altar. There were no personal photos, no knickknacks, nothing that betrayed a human heart. Just weapons mounted in glass cases and a view of the storm raging over the Hudson River. He locked the heavy door behind them, throwing 3 separate deadbolts. He then walked to a panel on the wall and punched in a code. Steel shutters slowly descended over the floor-to-ceiling windows, blocking out the lightning and sealing the room in a metallic cocoon. "The room is soundproof, bulletproof, and bomb-resistant," Alessandro said, his voice flat. He walked over to a wet bar in the corner and poured 2 fingers of amber liquid. He didn't offer her any. He needed the edge off, just a fraction. Audrey stood in the center of the room, hugging her arms around herself. The silk dress felt like paper against the chill of the air conditioning. She felt exposed, not just physically, but spiritually. The note on the pillow had stripped away her anonymity. "Sit," Alessandro commanded, pointing to the edge of the bed. Audrey sat. The mattress was firm, military grade. Alessandro pulled a heavy leather armchair from the corner and positioned it facing the door. He sat down, placing his handgun on the small table beside him. He loosened his tie, the fabric hissing as he pulled it from his collar. "Talk," he said. He didn't look at her. He was watching the door. "The Ouroboros. You called them Vipera. I know every syndicate from Moscow to Medellin. I have never heard of Vipera." Audrey took a shaky breath. She looked at his profile. The sharp jawline, the exhaustion etched around his eyes. He was a predator, yes, but tonight he was a predator in a cage, just like her. "You wouldn't have heard of them," Audrey whispered. "They aren't a syndicate. They don't run drugs or guns. They don't hold territory." Alessandro turned his head slowly to look at her. "Then what do they do?" "They clean," she said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "When a government needs a coup to look like a riot, they call Vipera. When a CEO needs a rival to have a heart attack that looks natural, they call Vipera. They are mercenaries, but worse, they are believers. They believe they are balancing the scales of the world." Alessandro's eyes narrowed. "And your father? The professor?" Audrey looked down at her hands. "He was one of them, a strategist. He planned the operations. But then he met my mother. He wanted out. You don't leave Vipera. You just run until you die." "So he ran," Alessandro surmised. "And he took you with him, and he taught you their language." "He taught me how to survive them," Audrey corrected. "The languages, the codes, how to disappear. He told me that one day a black rose would show up, and that would mean the clock had run out. And tonight, the clock ran out." "Yes." The silence that followed was heavy, but it wasn't hostile anymore. It was the silence of 2 soldiers in a foxhole realizing the enemy is closer than they thought. Alessandro stood up and walked over to her. He towered over the bed. For a moment, Audrey thought he might touch her, and her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. But he didn't reach for her. He reached past her, grabbing a heavy wool blanket from the foot of the bed. He draped it over her shoulders. The wool was rough but warm, smelling faintly of cedar and him. "Sleep," he said. "You take the bed. I will take the chair." "You can't stay awake all night," she argued softly. "I haven't slept a full night in 10 years, Audrey. One more night won't kill me." He walked back to the chair and sat down, picking up his gun. He rested it on his thigh, his hand loosely covering the grip. "If they are coming, they will come before dawn. Close your eyes." Audrey lay back. She didn't think she could sleep. Every shadow looked like a monster. Every creak of the house sounded like a footstep. She watched Alessandro from beneath her lashes. He was perfectly still, a statue of vigilance. It was a strange intimacy. There was no romance in it, no softness, but there was protection. For the first time since her father died, someone else was standing between her and the dark. "Alessandro?" she whispered into the gloom. "Why didn't you hand me over?" she asked. "If you give me to them, maybe they leave you alone. I'm the one they want." Alessandro was silent for a long time. The storm rattled the steel shutters outside. "Because," he said finally, his voice low and rough, "I am a killer, Audrey. I am a criminal. But I am not a traitor of flesh. And nobody touches what belongs to me." Belongs to me. The phrase should have terrified her. Instead, it sent a strange, warm shiver down her spine. She pulled the blanket tighter, the scent of him surrounding her, and against all odds, she fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. The attack didn't begin with a bang. It began with a click. It was 3:42 a.m. Audrey woke up instantly. She didn't gasp. She didn't move. Her father's training kicked in before her conscious mind did. Wake in silence. Assess. The room was pitch black. The small standby light on the television was gone. The hum of the air conditioning had died. The power had been cut. She shifted her eyes toward the chair. Alessandro was already moving. In the absolute darkness, she couldn't see him, but she could hear the soft slide of fabric as he stood up. "Stay down." His voice was a barely audible breath near the floor. He had moved away from the chair. He was positioning himself. Then came the sound. It wasn't at the door. It was the window. A high-pitched whirring noise, like a dentist's drill, came from behind the steel shutters. They were cutting through the locks. "They're coming through the balcony," Alessandro whispered. "Get to the bathroom. Lock the door. Lie in the tub." "No," Audrey hissed back, sliding off the bed. "If they cut the power, they bypass the electronic locks. The bathroom door won't hold." "Do as I say." Crash. The steel shutters didn't roll up. They were blown inward with a controlled charge. The explosion was deafening in the small space. Smoke and debris filled the room. Through the hole in the shutters, 3 figures swung in on rappel lines. They wore sleek, black tactical gear and night vision goggles that glowed like green, demonic eyes in the smoke. Alessandro opened fire. Bang! 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 The muzzle flashes from his Sig Sauer lit up the room in strobe light bursts. One of the intruders jerked backward, falling out the window. But the other 2 were fast. Unnaturally fast. They rolled across the floor, separating. They were suppressed. Their weapons made only wet thwip-thwip sounds as bullets chewed into the walls and the bed where Audrey had been seconds ago. Alessandro was pinned behind the heavy leather armchair. He fired blindly to keep them back, but he was losing the angle. "Valerius!" one of the assassins shouted, his voice distorted by a mask. "Give us the girl and you live!" Alessandro didn't answer. He popped up and fired. Click. His slide locked back. He was empty. He cursed, reaching for the spare magazine on the table. But a bullet struck the table, shattering the lamp and sending the magazine skittering across the floor, out of reach. The assassin on the left moved in. He saw Alessandro was empty. He raised his rifle, aiming for Alessandro's chest. Alessandro braced himself. He had a knife in his boot, but at this distance he was a dead man. Then the shadows moved. Audrey didn't run to the bathroom. She had rolled onto the bed when the explosion hit. Now she slid out from the opposite side, right behind the second assassin. She didn't have a gun. She held the heavy brass candlestick she had taken from her room earlier. She had hidden it in the folds of the blanket. She didn't scream. She didn't hesitate. She swung with the mechanics of a baseball player, swinging for the fences. Crack! The brass base connected with the assassin's knee. The sound of bone shattering was sickeningly loud. The assassin howled, buckling. As he fell, his rifle swung wild. Audrey didn't stop. She dropped the candlestick and lunged for his falling body. She wasn't fighting like a waitress. She moved with fluid, terrifying efficiency. She grabbed the assassin's knife from his vest, ripped it free, and jammed it into the gap of his body armor, right between the neck and the shoulder. He dropped like a stone. The first assassin, the one aiming at Alessandro, spun around, distracted by the commotion. That split second was all Alessandro needed. He didn't dive for the magazine. He dove for the assassin. He tackled the man, slamming him into the wall. The rifle skittered away. They grappled in the dark, a brutal mess of fists and elbows. Alessandro was strong, a brawler, but the assassin was technical, twisting Alessandro's arm, trying to break the joint. Audrey picked up the fallen rifle. It was an HK 416, heavy and cold. She checked the chamber, loaded. She raised it. The two men were a blur of motion in the shadows. If she missed, she would kill Alessandro. "Alessandro, drop!" she screamed. He didn't ask questions. He threw his weight back and collapsed to the floor, dragging the assassin down with him but creating a 6-inch gap between their heads. Audrey pulled the trigger. Thwip! A single shot. The assassin went limp, falling on top of Alessandro. Silence rushed back into the room, ringing in their ears. The only sound was the wind howling through the shattered window and the rain lashing against the expensive Persian rugs. Alessandro pushed the dead body off him. He lay there for a second, breathing hard, blood dripping from a cut on his forehead. He looked up. The emergency lights flickered on, bathing the room in a dim, eerie red glow. Audrey stood in the center of the room. She was covered in dust. Her silk dress was torn at the hem. Her hair was wild. She was holding the assault rifle with perfect form, stock pressed to her shoulder, finger indexed along the trigger guard, scanning the window for more threats. She looked like a Valkyrie of death. She wasn't the trembling girl from the restaurant. She wasn't the waitress. Alessandro slowly stood up. He wiped the blood from his eye, never taking his gaze off her. "Clear," Audrey said, her voice devoid of emotion. She lowered the weapon but didn't drop it. She turned to face him. Alessandro looked at the dead men, professional mercenaries. Vipera. Then he looked at Audrey. He looked at the way she held the gun. He looked at the dead man with the knife in his neck, a precision kill. He walked toward her. He didn't look grateful. He looked furious, and awestruck, and terrified. He stopped inches from the barrel of her gun. "You said you watched movies," Alessandro whispered, his voice shaking with adrenaline. Audrey looked up at him. The adrenaline was fading, and her hands started to tremble again. She dropped the rifle. It clattered loudly on the floor. "I lied," she said softly. Alessandro reached out. He grabbed her by the shoulders, hard. He pulled her against him, burying his face in her neck. He held her so tightly it hurt, as if checking she was real, as if trying to absorb the shock of what he had just seen. "You're not a translator," he murmured into her skin. "No," Audrey admitted, her forehead resting against his chest, listening to the frantic beat of his heart. "I'm the daughter of the Viper, and I just started a war." Alessandro pulled back. He looked into her eyes, searching for the waitress he thought he knew, and finding the partner he didn't know he needed. "Good," Alessandro snarled, a dark, dangerous smile spreading across his bloodied face. "I was getting bored with peace." The adrenaline began to crash, leaving behind a cold, sharp clarity. Marco and the rest of the security detail burst into the room seconds later, weapons drawn, but they were too late for the fight and just in time for the cleanup. Alessandro held up a hand, stopping them. "Nobody leaves this room," he ordered, his voice terrifyingly calm. "Marco, check the bodies. No ID, I assume." "None, boss. Marco said, kicking the rifle away from the dead assassin. "Clean gear. Vipera." Alessandro turned to Audrey. She was wiping soot from her face, her hands steady now. "You said they bypassed the locks. That system is hardwired. It can't be hacked remotely. Someone had to physically trip the breaker at the trellis outside to kill the magnetic seal. And someone had to give them the layout," Audrey added, her eyes scanning the room. She looked at the door. "Who else has the override codes, Alessandro?" "Only 3 people," Alessandro said, a dark realization dawning on him. "Me, Marco." The door opened again. Julian Thorne, the consigliere, hurried in, looking disheveled, his tie askew. "Alessandro, I heard shots. The power went out. I couldn't get the elevators to work. Are you?" He stopped, seeing the bodies. He looked pale. "My God, who are they?" Alessandro watched him. He watched his oldest friend, the man who had stood by him at his father's funeral. He looked at Julian's face, etched with concern. But Audrey wasn't looking at Julian's face. She was looking at his shoes. "Julian," Audrey said softly. Julian snapped his head toward her, annoyed. "What? Who is this girl, Alessandro? Why is she holding a rifle?" "Your shoes," Audrey said, stepping forward. "They're wet, and there is red clay on the heel." Julian looked down instinctively. "The grounds are paved," Audrey continued, her voice gaining strength. "The only place with red clay is the garden bed beneath the trellis, where the circuit breaker is." The silence that stretched across the room was suffocating. Julian looked up, and the mask of the concerned friend slipped. Underneath there was panic. "Alessandro," Julian stammered, backing up. "She's in shock. She's crazy." "I was running through the courtyard." "The courtyard is marble," Alessandro said. His voice broke, just a fraction. It was the sound of a heart breaking. "You sold me, Julian? For what? Money?" "For survival," Julian shouted, his hand twitching toward his jacket pocket. "Vipera's going to wipe the board clean. They offered me a way out. You're going to lose, Alessandro. You're fighting ghosts." Julian drew his gun. He was fast, but Marco was loyal. Bang! A single shot from Marco's sidearm took Julian in the chest. The consigliere fell backward, crashing into the same wall the assassin had breached. Alessandro didn't flinch. He walked over to his dying friend. He looked down, his expression unreadable, though his knuckles were white as he gripped his own weapon. "You were wrong, brother," Alessandro whispered. "I'm not fighting ghosts. I have one of my own." Julian took one last rattling breath and went still. The sun began to rise over the Hudson, casting a pale gray light over the carnage. The storm had passed. An hour later, Alessandro stood on the main balcony, now wearing a fresh suit, though he hadn't washed the gunpowder from his hands. Audrey joined him. She was wearing a heavy trench coat Marco had found for her. She handed him a phone. "It's for you." "Who is it?" "Kenji Sato." Alessandro took the phone. "Sato. I hear you had visitors." Kenji's voice crackled over the line. "And I hear my favorite translator sent them to hell." "She did," Alessandro said, glancing at Audrey. "The Viper killed my uncle in Tokyo 10 years ago," Kenji said, his voice hard. "If you are hunting them, Alessandro, the Sato clan stands with you. I am sending 50 men to your estate. They arrive at noon." "Thank you, Kenji." Alessandro hung up. He leaned against the stone railing, looking at Audrey. She looked small in the big coat, but her eyes were fierce. She wasn't a victim anymore. She wasn't a waitress. "You can go," Alessandro said. "With Sato's men here, the perimeter is secure. I can fly you to Europe. New identity. You can disappear. You can be safe." Audrey looked out at the river. She thought about her empty apartment in Queens. She thought about the years of running, of hiding, of pretending to be nobody. Then she looked at Alessandro. The wolf of New York. The man who had covered her with his own body when the bullets flew. "I'm tired of running, Alessandro," she said quietly, "and I'm tired of hiding who I am." "It will be a war," Alessandro warned. "Vipera won't stop." "Good," Audrey said. She reached out and took his hand. Her fingers were cold, but his grip was warm, solid, and permanent. "I know their codes. I know their safe houses. I know how they think. You have the army, Alessandro, but I have the map. Alessandro pulled her closer. He brushed a stray hair from her face, his thumb grazing her cheekbone. The tension of the night dissolved into something electric, something undeniable. "I hired a translator," he murmured, leaning down until their foreheads touched. "You got a partner," she whispered back. "I think," Alessandro said, just before his lips brushed hers, "I got the better end of the deal." He kissed her. It wasn't gentle. It was a seal on a contract written in blood and gunpowder, a promise that together they would burn the world down to build a new one. The waitress was gone. The queen had arrived. And that is how a spilled glass of champagne turned a waitress into the most dangerous woman in the underworld. Audrey Vance didn't just survive the mafia. She conquered it. They say behind every great man is a woman, but in Alessandro's case, the woman is standing right next to him, holding the rifle. This story reminds us that sometimes the people we think are invisible are the ones holding all the cards. Audrey and Alessandro's war against Vipera is just beginning. Did you get chills during that breach scene? If you want to see part 2, where they take the fight to Europe and hunt down the Viper, hit that like button and get this video to 5,000 likes. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on the bell. You do not want to miss the next episode of our Mafia romance saga. And tell me in the comments below, if you were Audrey, would you have taken the money and ran or stayed to fight? I'll be pinning the best theory. Thanks for watching, and stay dangerous.